horrible. The future looks bleak. Remember our childhood to get us through the week. We're getting re-enthused. Back to the past and the things we used. We all know that our pasts were great, escaping the things that today we hate. Getting re-enthused. Getting re-enthused. Getting re-enthused. Getting re-enthused.
Hello and welcome to Re-enthused. Today we are looking at another fairly obscure console, although this one is probably quite well known in terms of obscure consoles. It's a confusing statement, but it's quite well known because of the people involved, or rather one of the particular companies involved. Now, the company we're talking about is Apple, and from saying that, quite a lot of people watching this will understand what this console is. Apple have had a fairly up and down relationship with gaming. They went from a company which kind of rigorously went against gaming, decided their machines weren't for games, then kind of mellowed on that, and then with the release of the iPhone it effectively went down to not interested in games, and now they're kind of back realising that games actually make quite a lot of money, and so they're suddenly fans of it again. This represents a time when Apple decided to kind of not exactly bet the farm on gaming, but certainly make gaming a priority. So this is the Bandai atmark Pippin. It's effectively an Apple Mac in a kind of home casing. Specifically, it's a Power Mac in a home casing. Now, it's designed not to work without a monitor. It's designed to work without a keyboard and a mouse, although it has an alternative, which we'll get into in a bit. But it really is kind of Apple's attempt to break into that home market, and they did do it with games. Now, the reason the games, I suspect, were mostly involved was because they decided to partner with Bandai to sell this in parts of the world, mostly Japan. And Bandai are mostly known for gaming and toys, so that was always going to be part of it. In fact, Bandai ended up making quite a large amount of the software for this, especially in Japanese regions. Now, to say this was a flop is almost understating the word. This sold very few consoles around the world. The estimates vary wildly, but it's believed it's like 50,000 in America at most will even ship to the shops. So it was a massive, massive flop, and it happened in a part of Apple's life when they were still struggling to get market share, and the market share they did have with the Apple Mac line was starting to pair off, and so the idea was that they were going to try to get the Apple Mac into as many places as possible. It was around this time as well they started allowing clones to make Apple Macs. And that's effectively what this was. Apple never intended to make the hardware for this. They effectively made a reference design, which is basically a performer Mac, and then other people were going to make them. And that kind of happened. Bandai were responsible for the Japanese one. There was an American one as well, and very briefly a European one, which was released by Cats Media. That's even rarer. I mean, the American and Cats Media Black ones, versions of these, are incredibly rare. I've never even physically seen one, let alone own one. So, yeah, incredible flop. And there's several reasons for that. When this came out, it was about $700, which kind of makes sense because the chip in this, although not the fastest Power Mac, it was still a fairly advanced chip for the time. It was a PowerMac 603 running at 66 megahertz, which was on the lower end of the PowerMac lines, but still a very advanced chip. Plus, the way this is designed is very flexible, and there's a lot of engineering gone into it. So the fact that it was incredibly expensive was not surprising. The second part of this was that this was released properly in 1996, and that's 2 years after both the PlayStation and the Saturn, and this could not do 3D anything worth talking about. And so it released into a market where it was the most expensive machine around, and also the least capable, at least in terms of 3D. So yeah, it's a weird move, but it's at a time in Apple's life when they were making a lot of weird moves, so it's not that surprising. So let's take a little look at the machine itself. Now we can see here we've got lots and lots and lots of soft buttons. Obviously the eject to spit out this double speed tray CD-ROM. We can see a microphone socket and two joypad sockets at the front. We'll get to the joypad in a bit. That's actually a bit of a work of wonder. Some media controls, volume, fast forwarding and reversing, stops, plays, and the actual power button. Now, the back is where this thing really gets interesting. It was massively designed for the world market, not for one particular market, which is another thing that's different as well from the consoles, but the consoles were very much designed with the market they were being shipped into. So you see on the back there's a standard IEC cable, or kettle lead if you prefer, and this can support between 100 and 240 volts, so it is capable of being used across the world. It's got a VGA output which kind of shows off its PC roots, and a switch here which lets you turn between PAL and NTSC signals, so this genuinely could be used in any region. You could ship this to any country and it would run. The external ports as well are relatively bewildering. S-video and composite, but also imports as well for the audio, so you could plug in external microphones and everything. A printer port, and this port here with the little globe on, which was for the included modem. It did come with a modem. And Apple did make some fairly, obviously short-lived online functions for this, AOL-style gated communities, which of course were not well used because not many people bought the machine. But it's yeah, it's a fascinating piece of engineering what they've done. They really did put some work into it. Now, the controller. The controller is rather wonderfully called the Apple Jack, and it genuinely is a thing of beauty. So it's this little boomerang shaped thing here, but it's just it's a lot of buttons for a start. There's a lot of feature buttons here which do various things in games and applications. There's some shoulder buttons, and the four face buttons in a fairly Nintendo-esque configuration, certainly. But this here in the middle, this here is a trackball. If you've never used a trackball before, just consider it to be an inverse mouse. You say, for a second, just because it'd be an inverse mouse, but if you've never used a trackball, you probably have never used a mouse with a ball. Anyway, it's for controlling a cursor, which is kind of useful. There are some functions which use this. Of course, the internet side of things obviously use that quite a lot. But some games as well, the pointers and clickers allow you to use the trackball, and you can then use the shoulder buttons as the mouse buttons. So yeah, it's an interesting shoulder, and the cable is incredibly long, which I just love. I mean, if only more cables were like that. Yeah, so it's a really good control. It's also quite comfortable. It doesn't feel, you don't really feel like anything's out of reach, even the trackball. So it's a very comfortable control. It's actually a very good controller. We've put a lot of work into that. Right, so the software. There isn't very much. Buying it is near impossible. I mean, it doesn't go for particularly high prices when you do find it, but you just don't find it very often. There weren't very many titles released at all. Most of them were released in Japan, so quite a lot of them were made by Bandai themselves. There's an awful lot of anime-inspired ones there, especially Gundam. There are a few titles in America which are very hard to get hold of, even in ISO format. And there were like two versions of applications for the European market, but they were kind of really both just rebadged versions of American titles, so not much to talk about. But we will take a look at them now. I would like, so before we go, one of the things that was released for this, which is quite good, is a version of Marathon. Now, if you don't know Marathon, that was the precursor, effectively, to Halo, made by Bungie, and it's the game that kind of put them on the map. The version for this is actually very good. It's quite easy to control and doesn't look impressive by today's standards, and certainly not that impressive compared to what PlayStation was eventually putting out, especially 2 years later when this came out. But still quite impressive on its own right. So, see you in a minute.